If the flood wiped out the old world, why do giant clans appear again later in the Bible? That is one of the hardest and most fascinating biblical questions, and tonight we will walk through it carefully, verse by verse, story by story. We will start in Genesis 6, move through the nations after the flood, stand with the spies in Numbers 13, face Og of Bashan in Deuteronomy, follow Joshua's campaign, and finally arrive in the Valley of Elah, where David meets Goliath. This is not about fantasy. This is about scripture, context, and what these stories reveal about fear, faith, and the faithfulness of God. By the end, you will see that the giant narrative is not just ancient history. It is a mirror for every believer who has ever stood in front of something that looked impossible. Genesis 6 opens like a wound. Humanity is multiplying across the earth, but the chapter quickly turns dark. We read that the sons of God saw that the daughters of humans were beautiful and took them as wives. Then comes the line that has echoed through centuries. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward. Right there, the Bible gives us both data and mystery. Data. Something deeply wrong is happening. Violence is swelling. Corruption is spreading. God sees that human wickedness has become great. Mystery. Who exactly are the sons of God, and how does that connect to the Nephilim? Faithful readers have offered different interpretations. Some understand sons of God as angelic beings crossing boundaries God never intended. Others understand it as godly human lines intermarrying with rebellious lines, are producing cultural and moral collapse. The text itself does not pause to answer every modern question we bring to it. What it does make clear is this. Genesis 6 describes a world where boundaries are breaking, violence is normal, and the earth is filling with corruption. However we parse every detail, the result is not debated. Judgment is coming. The flood is not random rage. It is moral intervention. God is not overreacting to human imperfection. He is confronting a world spiraling beyond repair. And in that collapse, one man finds favor. Noah. Noah builds while everyone else mocks. Noah obeys while everyone else ignores. Noah enters the ark while everyone else assumes tomorrow will look like yesterday. Then the sky tears open. The flood becomes the great dividing line in human history, before and after. The old world drowns. A new beginning emerges from water. So if everything outside the ark perished, the appearance of giant clans after the flood is not just interesting, it is a theological puzzle. It forces us to read carefully and humbly. Because the Bible is not embarrassed by hard questions, and faithful people should not be either. After the waters recede, Genesis gives us the table of nations in Genesis 10. Families spread, tribes form, languages and lands begin to define identity. This chapter may look like a list of names, but it is actually the map of civilization being rebuilt. Then Genesis 11 narrows the lens to Babel. Humanity gathers with one language, one voice, one project. Let us build ourselves a city and a tower. Let us make a name for ourselves. That line reveals the heart. It is not architecture God opposes. It is autonomy, humanity unified in pride, trying to secure glory without God. So God confuses their language and scatters them. The world fractures into nations. And from this point on, the Bible tells the story of one covenant line through Abraham, while the nations around that line often become places of spiritual conflict, idolatry, and violence. Why does this matter for our question? Because when Israel later enters Canaan, they encounter peoples described as unusually large, formidable, and terrifying. The giant traditions do not appear as random folklore. They appear in specific regions, among specific clans, in the context of land, covenant, and war. Could these post-flood giants be direct continuation of the same pre-flood phenomenon? Some argue yes. Could they be large warrior peoples remembered through fearful language and cultural memory? Some argue that too. Could there be a mix of historical reality and theological emphasis? possibly. What we must not do is flatten the text into either sensational fantasy or sterile disbelief. The Bible wants us alert. It presents a world where evil reorganizes after judgment. The flood did not end rebellion forever. It restrained, reset, and redirected history toward redemption. And in the new world, the old war continues, not always in the same form, but with the same ancient heartbeat. Resist God, corrupt what is holy, terrify people into surrender. Fast forward to Numbers 13. Israel has come out of Egypt by miracles. The sea split, manna fell. Sinai shook with God's voice. They are standing on the edge of promise. Moses sends 12 spies into Canaan. For 40 days they scout the land. When they return, they bring fruit so massive it takes 2 men to carry 1 cluster of grapes. The land is real, the promise is real, the opportunity is real. But then fear begins to preach. 10 spies say, yes, the land flows with milk and honey, but the cities are fortified, the people are strong, and then this line detonates in the camp. We saw the Nephilim there, we seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we looked the same to them. That sentence is one of the most psychologically revealing lines in Scripture. Notice what happens. First, they observe external strength. Then they internalize inferiority. Then they project that inferiority onto the enemy's perspective. Like we are grasshoppers, and they see us that way too. Fear has a liturgy. It trains you to confess defeat before the fight starts. Now, was Nephilim here a precise biological claim, a label of terror, or both? The text reports what the spies said. It does not explicitly validate every emotional interpretation in their report. In fact, their report leads to rebellion against God's command. Caleb and Joshua stand in direct opposition. We should go up and take possession of the land, for we can certainly do it. Same land, same enemies, same evidence, different spirit. The majority sees giants and concludes, we cannot. Faith sees God and concludes, we must. This is where the Nephilim question stops being abstract, because every generation faces moments where the promise of God is clear, but the obstacles look enormous. And in those moments, your future is often decided by what voice you amplify, the voice of fear or the voice of faith. Israel chose fear. The result was 40 years of wandering, not because God was weak, but because unbelief is expensive. When we move into Deuteronomy 2 and 3, Moses is recounting Israel's journey and battles. Here we encounter names tied to giant traditions, the Rephaim, the Anakim, and especially Og, king of Bashan. Og is described as the last of the Rephaim, and Deuteronomy notes the size of his bed, roughly 9 cubits by 4 cubits, often estimated around 13.5 feet by 6 feet, depending on cubit length. Even allowing for ancient measurement debates, the text is deliberately emphasizing extraordinary scale. Why preserve that detail? Yeah, because Israel needed to remember that enemies who looked impossible were still defeatable when God fought for them. Moses is not giving trivia. He is building memory. You faced Og. You survived. God delivered him into your hand, so don't tremble now. That is the pastoral power of Deuteronomy. Remember what God has already done, so you do not panic about what is next. And here again we must hold conviction with humility. The text clearly affirms unusually formidable foes connected with older giant clans. It does not provide modern scientific categories. It does not explain every mechanism. It does not satisfy every speculative curiosity. But it does reveal a pattern. Again and again, giant-like enemies function as symbols of overwhelming opposition, militarily, psychologically, spiritually. They stand like mountains in front of God's people, daring them to doubt. And again, God says, do not fear them. That command still confronts us. Most people are not facing literal giant warriors, but many are facing debts that feel giant, diagnoses that feel giant, addictions that feel giant, regret that feels giant, systems that feel giant, shame that feels giant. The spirit of the giant is not just size, it is intimidation. It convinces you surrender is realism. But Deuteronomy whispers through history, even Og falls. By Joshua 11, Israel is deep in conquest narratives. Battles spread across the land, and one line stands out with surgical force. Joshua cut off the Anakim from the hill country, Hebron, Debir, Anab. Strongholds of fear become testimonies of victory. Yet the text also says some remained in Gaza, Gath, and Ashdod. That detail matters. Victory is real, but conflict is not instantly erased. God gives decisive breakthroughs, yet remnants remain to be dealt with in later generations. This is one of the most realistic patterns in Scripture. People often expect spiritual life to work like a switch. One prayer, one moment, one breakthrough, and every struggle vanishes forever. Sometimes God does work that way. Often he works like Joshua 11, major victory now, remaining battles later. And those remaining strongholds can become future threats if ignored. Remember those city names? Gaza, Gath, Ashdod, especially Gath. Because generations later, from Gath, a champion will walk into a valley and defy the armies of the living God. The story is setting the stage long before David appears. The Bible is woven with continuity. Threads in Joshua become crises in Samuel. What one generation tolerates, another generation must confront. So if we ask, why do giants still appear after the flood? One biblical answer is practical and sobering. Because history is long, evil adapts, and unfinished obedience leaves unfinished enemies. That is not defeatist, it is watchful. God's promises stand, but participation matters. Then we arrive at 1 Samuel 17. This is perhaps the most famous giant narrative in the Bible, but familiarity can make us forget how terrifying the scene really was. For 40 days, morning and evening, Goliath of Gath steps forward and taunts Israel. His height is extraordinary by any reading. His armor is massive. His spearhead is heavy. His voice is war propaganda wrapped in blasphemy. He is not just challenging soldiers, he is mocking God. And Israel freezes. King Saul, the tallest man in Israel, the one who should have stepped out, stays in paralysis with everyone else. Then a teenager arrives with bread and cheese. David is not on assignment to fight. He is running errands for his father. But when he hears the giant's defiance, something in him burns. Notice David's language. He does not start with military analysis. He starts with covenant identity. Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? David sees what others forgot. This fight is not giant versus boy. It is defiance versus devotion. Saul offers armor. David refuses. Not because preparation is bad, but because borrowed confidence is brittle. David takes what he knows: staff, sling, stones, and above all, memory. The Lord who delivered me from the lion and the bear will deliver me from this Philistine. There it is again. Memory as weapon. Goliath curses David by his gods. David answers with one of the boldest declarations in Scripture. You come against me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty. And the whole world will know that there is a God in Israel. Then he runs toward the battle line. One stone, one strike, one giant down. The same valley that echoed with intimidation now echoes with Israel's pursuit. This is why the giant narratives matter. They reveal that what looks unbeatable can collapse in a moment when faith moves forward. Not because technique replaces God, not because courage is magic, but because God is still God when monsters shout. Now we face the central question directly. Why do Nephilim or giant-like figures appear after the flood? Here is a careful, Scripture-respecting approach. First, Genesis 6 explicitly says, "The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward." At minimum, the text leaves room for a post-flood continuation of giant traditions in some form. Second, Later books describe groups associated with unusual size and fearsome reputation: Anakim, Rephaim, and figures like Og and Goliath. Scripture treats these encounters as real historical threats, not mere fairy tales. Third, the Bible does not provide a single, explicit post-flood biological explanation, so believers should avoid dogmatism where Scripture is not dogmatic. Because of that, several possibilities are discussed by faithful interpreters. One possibility is that something akin to the Genesis 6 corruption happened again after the flood in ways Scripture does not fully detail. Another possibility is that Nephilim in Numbers 13 reflects the fearful language of the spies, who may have used the term to describe terrifyingly large warriors rather than making a technical claim about exact lineage. Another possibility is that giant clan traditions developed through human lines over time, with extraordinary stature becoming attached to specific peoples and remembered through covenant conflict narratives. Each view has strengths and challenges, and here's the key: your faith does not stand or fall on solving every mystery in the mechanism. The theological message is already loud and clear. There are forces in history that exalt themselves against God. They intimidate nations. They corrupt cultures. They try to make covenant people forget who they are. But none of those forces are ultimate. The flood proves God judges corruption. The conquest narratives prove God can remove entrenched fear. David proves God can topple what an entire army calls impossible. So yes, ask hard questions, study deeply, compare texts carefully. But do not miss the point while chasing the puzzle. Scripture is not feeding curiosity for entertainment. It is training courage for obedience. Let's bring this home. Most people listening tonight are not wondering about ancient giants because of archaeology alone. You're wondering because you recognize the pattern. You've stood on the edge of something God called you to do, and suddenly everything looked too big. The calling looked right, but the opposition looked huge. The promise looked beautiful, but the risk looked unbearable. And a voice rose inside you. You are a grasshopper. You are too late. You are too weak. You are too damaged. You should retreat. That voice has ancient roots. It spoke through 10 spies. It thundered from Goliath. It whispers in every generation. But God has never asked His people to pretend giants are small. He asks us to remember that giants are not God. Maybe your giant is private. Sin nobody knows. Fear nobody sees. Grief you can't name. Maybe your giant is public. Debt, pressure, conflict, uncertainty about the future. Maybe your giant is spiritual exhaustion. You're tired of trying, tired of praying, tired of waiting. You hear this clearly. The presence of a giant does not mean the absence of God. The size of your enemy is not a measure of your destiny. And delay is not denial when God is still writing the story. Israel had moments of cowardice and moments of conquest. David had a sling, not a sword. Joshua had battles left unfinished. Yet God kept moving history toward His promise. He still does. So what do you do now? You do what Scripture keeps teaching. Remember what God has done. Refuse the vocabulary of defeat. Take the next faithful step. Run toward the line, not away from it. You may not have all the answers about the Nephilim. You may not solve every mystery before sunrise. But you can choose today which report you will believe. The report of fear, or the report of the living God. The question was never only, did giants exist after the flood? The deeper question is this: when giants stand in front of you, who gets the final word? Fear, culture, your past, the loudest voice in the valley, or God? If this message hit something deep in you, don't scroll past it like it was just another video. Pause. Pray. Name your giant. And ask God for the courage of Caleb, the memory of Moses, the persistence of Joshua, and the boldness of David. Then move. One prayer, one step, one act of obedience. That is how valleys change. That is how giants fall. That is how generations remember that the Lord still saves, not by sword or spear, but by His power. CTA. Start. If you want more biblical deep dives like this, where we face hard questions without hype and grow stronger in faith, subscribe now. Share this with someone who is fighting their own giant and drop a comment with one word. CTA and stand. Because in this generation, we will not be grasshoppers, we will stand. And the world will know there is a God who still delivers.